Frost clung to the dead pines, and Jeffrey's right arm was useless meat. Winter in the bitter roots didn't tolerate crippled men. He needed a housekeeper to survive the freeze. Not a desperate Polish immigrant with too much pride and a busted trunk. He bargained for chores. He got salvation. The trading post smelled of rotting onions, oiled leather, and the sour sweat of men who hadn't seen a bathhouse since spring. Jeffrey Ross stood near the potbelly stove, favoring his right side. His collarbone had been crushed by a falling lodgepole pine 6 weeks ago. The bone had knitted together into a hard, ugly knot beneath his skin, leaving his dominant arm hanging heavy and numb at his side. He could barely lift a coffee cup, let alone swing a splitting maul. And the first frost had already hardened the mud outside into treacherous ridges. "You're asking for a miracle, Ross," Thaddeus Boone said, leaning over the scarred wooden counter. Boone's teeth were stained brown with tobacco. His smile, a lazy, opportunistic thing. "Ain't no woman in her right mind gonna ride up to that rock pile of yours just to scrub your pots. Not with the snows coming." "I ain't asking for a woman," Jeffrey grated out. His voice was like two stones grinding together. "I'm asking for a worker. Board, keep, and $30 come the thaw. Just need somebody to boil water and keep the fires fed so I don't freeze to death in my own bed." Boone snorted, wiping down the counter with a rag that looked dirtier than the wood itself. $30. You'd have better luck buying a blind mule. I will take the $30. The voice came from the shadows near the sacks of flour. It was heavily accented, the consonants sharp and clipped. Jeffrey turned, his boots scuffing the floorboards. A woman stepped into the dim light of the lantern. She wasn't a saloon girl, and she wasn't some homesteader's runaway wife. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck. Her wool coat was 3 sizes too large, the cuffs frayed and caked with dried mud. Beneath a faded brown shawl, her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows. But her eyes, pale, flinty blue, were entirely steady. "You?" Jeffrey looked her up and down. She was too thin. A stiff wind would blow her off the mountain. "This ain't dusting parlors, lady. It's hauling cordwood, butchering frozen meat, and melting snow for water. It's back-breaking." "My back is not broken," she said simply. "Yours is." Jeffrey's jaw tightened. Boone chuckled into his rag. "She's Agnieszka," Boone supplied, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Came over from Poland with her daddy. Old man took sick with the cholera in Cheyenne. Died 2 weeks ago. Now, she owes me for the freight charge of bringing her trunk the rest of the way. She's stuck." Agnes didn't look at Boone. She kept her eyes on Jeffrey. She didn't plead. There were no tears pooling in her eyes, no tremble in her cracked lips. "I can chop wood. I can cook. I know how to skin a rabbit. You pay me the $30 in the spring, and a ticket on the train going west, to Oregon." Jeffrey stared at her. He hated the idea of a stranger in his cabin. He hated the noise people made, the space they took up, the inevitable expectations they harbored. He had moved to the Bitterroots to be entirely alone, but a sharp throb radiated from his twisted collarbone, a bitter reminder of his own mortality. If he tried to winter alone, they'd find him rigid and blue in his bedroll by February. "The cabin's 10 miles up the switchbacks," Jeffrey said, his voice flat. "It's cold. It's filthy. I don't talk much, and I don't want to be talked to. You mind your business, do the chores, and you get your money." "Yes," Agnes said. "I get my money." She had one trunk. It was battered pine, held together by iron bands and sheer stubbornness. Jeffrey managed to heave it into the back of his wagon with his left arm, his teeth bared in a silent grimace of pain as the effort pulled at his ruined shoulder. Agnes noticed, but she didn't offer to help. She just climbed onto the splintered buckboard and stared straight ahead. Jeffrey respected that. Pity made him violent. The ride up the mountain was brutal. The wind howled down the sheer rock faces, carrying the biting promise of ice. The mules plodded slowly, their hooves slipping on the frozen scree. Beside him, Agnes sat entirely rigid. She didn't shiver, though her lips had turned a faint shade of blue. She smelled faintly of lye soap, old wool, and dust. It was a stark contrast to the sharp, sappy scent of the pines. When they finally crested the ridge and the cabin came into view, Jeffrey felt a sudden, unfamiliar prickle of shame. It was a rough-hewn box of peeling logs, the chinking crumbling in places. The porch sagged under the weight of an old anvil. Inside, it was worse. Jeffrey pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, smelling of rancid bacon grease, damp ash, and unwashed wool. A mountain of cast-iron pans crusted with burnt food sat on the rusted stove. The dirt floor was littered with wood chips and dried mud. He watched her face, waiting for the horror to set in. He waited for her to realize what she had traded her life for. Agnes walked to the center of the room. She looked at the stove, the unmade cot, the frost creeping up the single filthy window pane. She let out a long, slow exhale. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. Then she unbuttoned her oversized coat, folded it neatly over a chair, and rolled up her sleeves. "Where is the bucket?" she asked. "I need water." The first 2 weeks were a silent, grueling war of attrition. The snow began to fall on a Tuesday and simply didn't stop. It buried the tree stumps, erased the wagon trail, and banked against the cabin walls like a white shroud. The world outside shrank to a few dozen yards of swirling gray visibility. Inside, the cabin became a pressure cooker of unspoken boundaries and forced routine. Agnes worked like a machine, fueled by spite. Jeffrey watched her from his chair by the fire, his bad arm slung inside his shirt. She was up before the sun, the scrape of the heavy iron poker against the grate waking him. By the time he rolled out of his blankets, there was chicory coffee boiling on the stove. It tasted like burnt earth, but it was hot. She scrubbed the floorboards with river sand and lye until her knuckles were raw and split. She dragged massive, icy chunks of cordwood through the snow, her boots slipping, her breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps. Jeffrey hated watching her do it. It gnawed at his pride, a constant, ugly reminder of his uselessness. One afternoon, he couldn't take it anymore. He pushed himself out of his chair and stalked out into the snow, grabbing the heavy splitting maul with his left hand. "Leave it," he barked at her as she bent over a frozen pine log. Agnes stepped back, wiping a strand of dirty blonde hair from her forehead. Her face was flushed, her nose red from the biting cold. She didn't argue. She just stood with her hands wrapped in her apron, watching. Jeffrey hoisted the heavy maul with his left arm. It was awkward, off balance. He swung. The blade hit the wood at a glancing angle, bouncing off the frozen grain with a harsh thwack. The reverberation shot up his left arm, jolting his body, and the sudden shift in weight yanked viciously at his ruined right shoulder. A sharp, breathless grunt tore from his throat. He dropped the maul, staggering back, his vision going white at the edges. He clamped his left hand over his bad shoulder, his chest heaving, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck despite the freezing air. He waited for her to say something, to tell him to go back inside, to look at him with that sickening, cloying sympathy women usually offered injured men. Agnes picked up the maul. "The wood is frozen," she said, her voice perfectly level. "You must hit it on the knot, where the tension is already broken." She hoisted the maul. She didn't swing it over her head like a lumberjack. She didn't have the upper body strength. Instead, she used the weight of the iron head, guiding it up and bringing it down with her entire body weight. It struck the knot, dead center. The log cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, splitting neatly in two. She bent down, gathered the halves, and walked past him into the cabin. Jeffrey stood in the snow for a long time, the cold seeping into his boots. He realized then that Agnes didn't care about his pride. She only cared about the fire. As November bled into December, the dynamic between them began to shift in microscopic ways. The suffocating silence stretched into something less hostile. Jeffrey found himself anticipating the subtle sounds of her presence, the rhythmic shh of her broom, the soft thud of dough being kneaded against the table, the metallic clink of her sewing needles in the evening. The food had changed. He was used to surviving on salted beef boiled to the texture of boot leather and dry hardtack. Agnes stretched his dwindling supplies with a harsh ingenuity. She made thick potato dumplings that sat heavy and warm in his stomach. She boiled the bones he would have thrown out, making a rich, gelatinous broth flavored with dried wild onions she'd found in the root cellar. The cabin smelled different now. The reek of grease and unwashed man was gone. It smelled of wood smoke, roasted roots, and the clean alkaline scent of the lye soap she used. He watched her in the evenings. The single kerosene lamp cast long, flickering shadows against the chinked walls. She would sit by the fire, mending his torn work shirts with a needle and thread, her movements precise. She never complained about the cold, though Jeffrey saw how her hands trembled when the drafts caught her. He noticed things he shouldn't have. He noticed the pale, delicate skin on the inside of her wrists, contrasting sharply with her calloused palms. He noticed that she chewed on the inside of her cheek when she was trying to thread a needle in the dim light. He noticed that she had a small, faded scar just beneath her jawline, barely visible unless she turned her head toward the fire. She was a knot of contradictions, hard as iron when she was working, yet entirely fragile when she sat exhausted by the hearth. One night, the wind outside was screaming, violently rattling the heavy wooden shutters. The temperature had plummeted so low that the nails in the roof beams popped with sounds like distant gunfire. Jeffrey was awake in his cot, staring at the ceiling. His shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. The cold always made the ruined bone ache deeper. Across the room, Agnes was shivering on her narrow bed. She had wrapped herself in 2 heavy wool blankets, but he could hear her teeth chattering in the darkness. He laid there, warring with himself. He was not a soft man. He did not comfort people. But the sound of her shivering grated on him. It dug under his skin. With a low growl of frustration, Jeffrey pushed himself up. He grabbed the heavy raw bearskin rug from the floor beside his bed, the warmest thing he owned. He walked across the freezing dirt floor in his woolen socks. He stopped beside her cot. She was curled into a tight ball, her face buried in her knees. Jeffrey dropped the bearskin heavily over her. Agnes flinched, gasping as she woke, her eyes wide and terrified in the dim embers of the dying fire. She looked at the massive fur covering her, then up at Jeffrey's looming silhouette. "You're keeping me awake," Jeffrey said gruffly, his voice a low rumble. "Stop rattling." He turned his back on her and walked back to his own cold cot, pulling his thin blanket to his chin. There was a long silence, save for the howling wind outside. Then, he heard the heavy fur shift as she pulled it tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly soft, devoid of the harsh edge it usually carried. Jeffrey didn't answer. He closed his eyes, ignoring the cold biting at his own legs, his mind fixed entirely on the sudden, terrifying realization that he was glad she was there. January ripped through the bitterroots with the jagged cruelty of a rusty saw. The cabin shrank. Snow drifted halfway up the single window, burying them in a dim gray twilight that lasted all day. The isolation was no longer just a circumstance. It was a physical weight pressing down on the sagging roof beams, forcing Jeffrey and Agnes into a suffocating, inescapable proximity. Then, the chest fever hit him. It didn't come on slowly. It hit Jeffrey like a broadside from a freight wagon. He woke one morning with a rattle deep in his lungs, and a fire baking the moisture from his eyes. By noon, he couldn't stand. By nightfall, he was thrashing in his cot, trapped in the suffocating grip of delirium, his ruined shoulder screaming in time with his racing pulse. He drifted in and out of a suffocating heat. He smelled sour sweat, stale wool, and the bitter, sharp tang of boiled willow bark. A cold, wet cloth slapped against his forehead. It was jarring. He tried to swat it away with his good arm, a feral grunt tearing from his cracked lips. "Stop," a voice ordered. It wasn't gentle. It was a sharp, flat command. Jeffrey peeled his heavy eyelids open. The edges of the room blurred, cast in the unsteady orange glow of the hearth. Agnes leaned over him. Her hair had escaped its tight braid, falling in damp, stringy strands around her gaunt face. She looked exhausted, the shadows under her pale blue eyes bruised and deep. She pressed a tin cup against his lower lip. The metal was burning hot against his skin. "Drink," she commanded. He clenched his jaw, stubbornly turning his head away. He hated this. He despised the helpless, pathetic reality of his own failing body. He had come to the mountains to avoid ever needing another human hand, and now he was too weak to even lift his own head. "I said drink," Agnes repeated, her voice dropping an octave. She didn't coddle him. She grabbed his jaw with her calloused fingers, her grip surprisingly strong, and forced his head back around. She tipped the cup. Hot, bitter liquid spilled over his tongue and down his chin, soaking into his woolen union suit. He choked, coughing violently. The spasms tore at his chest and sent agonizing spikes of pain through his collarbone. He grabbed her wrist to push her away, his fingers wrapping around the thin, fragile bones of her forearm. She didn't pull back. She just waited for the coughing to stop, her pale eyes locked onto his fevered ones. "I did not drag logs through ice for 3 months to watch you die of a cough," she said, her accent thick and sharp in the quiet cabin. "You owe me $30, Jeffrey Ross. You do not get to die before spring." He stared at her, his breath rattling in his throat. His thumb rested against the steady, rapid pulse at her wrist. Her skin was freezing, a stark contrast to his burning fever. For the first time, he noticed the faint smell of crushed pine needles lingering on her skin beneath the lye soap. A fractured, dry chuckle escaped his lips, turning instantly into a wheeze. "Stubborn," he rasped. "Yes," she said, pulling her arm away and dipping the rag back into the bucket of icy water. "Now, shut your mouth and sleep." For 6 days, she fought the fever. She didn't sleep in her own bed. She sat in the hard wooden chair beside his cot, feeding the fire, forcing bitter tea down his throat, and listening to the agonizing wheeze of his lungs. When the fever finally broke on the 7th night, Jeffrey woke to the sound of a roaring fire and the smell of roasting salt pork. His body felt as hollowed out as a rotting log, his muscles weak and trembling, but his mind was clear. He turned his head. Agnes was asleep in the chair, her head resting awkwardly against the rough timber wall. The heavy bearskin rug was draped over her lap. Her hands lay open on her knees, the skin cracked and bleeding at the knuckles from the harsh lie and the relentless cold. Jeffrey lay there, listening to the steady, quiet rhythm of her breathing. A strange, tight sensation gripped his chest, entirely unrelated to the illness. It was terrifying. He realized, with a cold plunge of clarity, that the cabin would be entirely empty without her. The silence he had once craved now felt like a threat. March arrived with the brutal sound of cracking ice. Meltwater dripped off the eaves in a constant, monotonous rhythm, turning the packed snow into treacherous gray slush. The frost receded from the window panes, revealing a harsh, blinding sky. The thaw had come, and with it, the end of the bargain. Jeffrey stood by the rough-hewn table, his boots coated in thick, heavy mountain mud. His right arm was still weak, the shoulder a permanent, ugly knot. But the fever had long passed. He reached under the loose floorboard near the stove and pulled out a rusted tobacco tin. He opened it. Inside were a stack of gold eagles and silver dollars, his survival money. He counted out $30. The coins were heavy, cold, and entirely indifferent. He stared at the small pile of metal on the scarred wood of the table. It seemed absurd. $30 for his life. $30 for the fire, the dumplings, the scent of lye, and the quiet rhythm of the mending needles. Agnes walked in from the porch, carrying the empty slop bucket. Her heavy wool coat hung even looser on her frame than it had in October. She saw the coins on the table. She stopped. The silence between them stretched, pulling taut, like wet rawhide. "The mud is thick," Jeffrey said, his voice grating in the quiet room. "But the wagon will make it down the switchbacks. Train comes through the valley on Thursdays." Agnes stared at the money. Her face was entirely unreadable. She walked to the table, set the bucket down, and slowly reached out. She swept the coins into her apron pocket. The metal clinked loudly, a harsh, transactional sound. "I will pack my trunk," she said. She didn't look up at him. She turned on her heel and walked to her corner of the room. The wagon ride down the mountain was worse than the ride up. The silence was suffocating. The wheels sank deep into the ruts, throwing thick brown mud against the buckboard. Jeffrey drove the mules with his left hand, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He kept waiting for her to say something, to comment on the weather, to complain about the jolting ride. She said nothing. She sat entirely rigid, staring at the muddy road ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When they finally rolled into the valley and pulled up to Thaddeus Boone's trading post, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of wet earth and manure. Boone was on the porch, leaning against a post, a smug grin spreading across his face as he watched them approach. "Well, I'll be damned," he called out, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the mud. "You survived, Ross. And you brought the stray back." Jeffrey wrapped the reins around the brake lever. He didn't look at Boone. He stepped down, his boots sinking into the muck. He walked to the back of the wagon and hauled Agnes's battered pine trunk out with his left arm, dropping it onto the wooden planks of the porch with a heavy thud. Agnes climbed down carefully. She didn't brush the mud from her skirts. She walked past Boone without acknowledging him and stood beside her trunk. "Train ticket to Oregon," Jeffrey said to Boone, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Westbound. You sell 'em here." Boone chuckled, wiping his mouth. "Sure do. $10. Agnes reached into her pocket. She pulled out the gold eagles Jeffrey had given her. Her hands were shaking. Just a fraction. She placed one of the heavy coins on the counter Boone had set up by the door. "One ticket," she said. Her voice clipped. Jeffrey watched her. His chest felt tight, a band of iron squeezing his ribs. He had his solitude back. He had his quiet. He could go back up the mountain and rot in peace. Boone slid the ticket across the counter. Agnes picked it up. She stared at the small piece of printed paper. It was everything she had worked for. It was freedom from the cold, from the dirt, from the harshness of the bitterroots. "Train comes in an hour," Boone said, grinning. "I got coffee inside. A dime a cup." Agnes didn't move. She stood on the porch, holding the ticket. She looked at the muddy road leading west. Then, slowly, she turned to look at Jeffrey. Jeffrey was standing by the wagon, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked angry. He looked broken. He looked entirely alone. "The roof," Agnes said quietly. Jeffrey frowned, his brow furrowing. "What?" "The roof above the stove," she said, her accent sharp, cutting through the damp spring air. "The snow pulled the shingles loose. When the heavy rains come in April, it will leak on the iron. It will rust." Jeffrey stared at her, completely baffled. "I know." Agnes took a step toward him, off the porch, her boots sinking into the mud. She stopped a few feet away. "You cannot fix it with one arm." "I'll manage," he ground out, defensive, his pride rearing up. "You will fall off the roof and break your neck," she corrected him flatly. "And the potato seeds must be planted behind the cabin before May, or they will not yield before the first frost." Jeffrey pulled his hands from his pockets. He stepped closer to her, closing the distance. The smell of wet wool and crushed pine hit him again. "Agnes, what are you talking about?" She looked down at the train ticket in her hand. Her thumb traced the printed letters. Then, with a sudden sharp movement, she tore the heavy paper in half. Boone let out a squawk of protest from the porch. "Hey, that's $10. Agnes let the torn pieces fall into the mud. She looked up at Jeffrey, her pale blue eyes fierce and entirely steady. $30 bought my winter, Jeffrey," she said, her voice dropping, losing its harsh edge, becoming something raw and vulnerable. "It does not buy my summer. If I plant those potatoes, I am staying to eat them." Jeffrey stood frozen. His mind raced, struggling to process the torn ticket in the mud and the fierce, stubborn set of her jaw. He looked at her cracked hands, her too thin frame, the faded scar on her jawline. He didn't have words. He had never been a man for words. Slowly, awkwardly, he reached out with his good arm. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He simply wrapped his large, rough hand around hers, his thumb brushing over her split knuckles. "The roof needs patching," he agreed, his voice thick, rough as gravel. Agnes looked down at his hand holding hers. A small, genuine smile, the first he had ever seen, broke across her face, softening the sharp angles of her cheekbones. "Yes," she said. "We will need a hammer." Jeffrey turned toward the porch. He looked at Boone, who was staring at them with his mouth hanging open. "Boone," Jeffrey barked, "load the trunk back in the wagon and fetch me 10 pounds of roofing nails." They rode back up the mountain together. The mud was deep, and the air was still cold. But the oppressive silence of the winter was gone, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of two people breathing in the same space. Did this harsh, bitterroot romance strike a chord? If you loved watching Jeffrey and Agnieszka fight the freezing mountain elements and their own stubborn hearts to find something truly priceless, let us know. Hit that like button, share this story with fellow historical romance fans, and subscribe to our channel for more raw, grounded frontier dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you have done with the $30? See you in the next Wild West tale.